Hi, I'm Russ Warad, and this is my presentation of my paper. It's tough to present a 32-page paper in a matter of 5 to 7 minutes, but here's my go. The title of my paper is actually Toward a Better Understanding of Sola Scriptura and its Impact on Leadership Development amongst Conservative Evangelicals. And the purpose of this paper, and really of my study overall in the Doctorate of Practical Theology program, revolves around issues that have arisen in the context of ministry leadership development and improvement, growing as leaders. Really, it started with my own personal experiences in being faced with ministry contexts that were beyond my current capacity. In the process of that, I sought out leadership material which was profoundly helpful for me and helped me adapt. And so I wanted to be able to take that material and information to others in ministry as well. That started with me traveling overseas to places like Romania to begin to communicate that, but we experienced resistance and challenges, often on the basis that the material was more secular or man-centered, but that it wasn't biblical. Then I had an opportunity to do the same and took on a national chair of church health and leadership within my denomination, the Associated Gospel Churches of Canada. And in the process of trying to engage other ministers as well, found that there was also, again, a resistance to leadership material. That the pastors, even in a North American context, felt that there was something wrong with using this leadership material, in particular secular leadership material. And I found that in an informal study that a third of the pastors were negative towards leadership material, another 1/3 were ambivalent, and another third were open, but they had reservation, leaving wholly more than 80% of the ministers in the AGC likely not improving in leadership capacity and skills development, even when statistics would show that leadership capacity is more important than ever before in the 21st century with all of the new and changing demands of the ministry context. And equally important for pastors is this, that since the vast majority of ministry failure and burnout is directly attributed to leadership skills deficiencies or lacking in capacity, this is an issue. And the reality is that many of my fellow ministers in the Associated Gospel Churches were hesitating to interact with potentially helpful leadership material because they hold to a potentially faulty understanding of Sola Scriptura. Every single respondent that I spoke with in my informal study cited Sola Scriptura and the sufficiency of Scripture at some point to justify their resistance to interact with leadership material, and particularly secular leadership material. But the question is, and the question in my paper is that what Sola Scriptura actually means? Well, if yes, then done. There's no point in me moving forward. I'm not advocating that somehow we be unfaithful to Scripture or to our theological moorings in Sola Scriptura. But if that's not what it means, then we need to develop a better understanding, as it is our understanding and our convictions around Sola Scriptura that stands as the major impediment to improved practice and capacity and skills building. Well, historically, the church has always struggled with the relationship between the sacred and the secular. Many of the early church apologists were among the most vocal in resisting the intrusion of natural philosophies and scientific pursuits into the realm of Christian belief. Tertullian, for instance, famously said, "What is there in common between Athens and Jerusalem? What between the academy and the church? What between heretics and Christians? Away with all projects for a Stoic or a Platonic or a dialectic Christianity." But Justin Martyr, on the other hand, was more positive. "Whatever has been uttered aright by any man in any place belongs to us Christians, for next to God we worship and love the reason, or the Word, which is from the unbegotten and ineffable God." Well, this tension persisted back and forth between the sacred and the secular, and then there was this key moment when the Reformers put a stake in the ground called Sola Scriptura and said, boom, here we go. But what exactly does that mean, and how should it be applied, has proven to be somewhat problematic, and a degree of confusion persists. My paper points out this. And for instance, in his Introducing Evangelical Theology, Daniel Traer defines sola scriptura as emphasizing the Bible as the sole final arbiter, that's key, of truth claims whose basic message, the gospel, is sufficiently clear that Scripture interprets Scripture and provides wisdom unto salvation with the due use of ordinary means. In defining it this way, we can see the emphasis on the need to allow Scripture to speak for itself and that it is the sole final arbiter of truth claims. In other words, things can claim truth. It's just that Scripture holds the final, if you will, approval status as to whether it's true or not. Matthew Barrett, in his book on sola scriptura, the Word, states that for the Reformers, sola scriptura meant the Bible is our final authority, but it did not mean the Bible is our only authority. See, he further argues that this understanding allows for the believer to look to and utilize extra-biblical sources, in that sola scriptura is not arguing that Scripture is the only authority or the only source from which we can draw. It is arguing that while there may be other good sources, these are always fallible and inferior to Scripture. By contrast, however, our word holder seemingly presents yet another different understanding of sola scriptura. He writes that for Luther, all of his authority for his theological positions was grounded in Scripture, and those traditions that might even be helpful to the running of human enterprise, such as the church, cannot claim to be authoritative without express legitimation in Scripture. So no longer final arbiter of truth, but he's saying that sola scriptura means that everything only has authority if it can be legitimized by Scripture. Hans Hillebrand also puts forward this idea by claiming that the delineation of the Reformation principle of authority was thus above all negative. It entailed the repudiation of other sources of authority. In other words, that sola scriptura pushed everything else off. It denied everything else. But the question is which one's right? Well, my paper is designed to show that by understanding the context within which sola scriptura arose and observing how it was applied by some of its earliest proponents, we can better understand the intent of sola scriptura. As a quick overview, studying the context shows that sola scriptura did not arise out of a desire to repudiate all other authorities. Historically, and in the eyes of the Church Fathers, Scripture was always supreme, but in the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries, a shift occurred as seen in the arguments made by Prierius, Eck, and Cajetan against Luther that placed the church councils, and especially the Pope, not only on par with Scripture, but above it. The Reformers' attempt was to put back Scripture into its rightful place and where they believed the Church Fathers had it. Well, does this mean then that the Reformers only looked to Scripture as the only authoritative source for insight? True, they did give Scripture the special place of being authoritative over all, especially on matters of faith, doctrine, and salvation. But they did interact widely. Luther himself wrote, "I do not want to throw out all those more learned than I, but Scripture alone to reign, and not to interpret it by my own spirit or the spirit of any man, but I want to understand it by itself and its spirit." In other words, I want to utilize other authorities. I want to not throw out this great history, but I do want Scripture to remain supreme. And in the Babylonian captivity of the church, he further wrote, "For what is asserted without scriptures or proven revelation may be held as an opinion, but it need not be believed." In other words, it may be your opinion, there may be value, it's just not got the stamp of absolute authoritative truth. Melanchthon, furthermore, wrote, "First, it is not in my heart to detract from the authority of anyone in any way. I revere and honor all the lights of the church, those illustrious defenders of Christian doctrine. Next, I consider it to be important that the opinions of the Holy Fathers, when they differ as they do, be judged by Scripture, vice versa." In other words, I want to hold on to this authority, but I'm going to make sure that even when they disagree from one another, and on every statement, I will judge it by authority. So, it's Scripture as sole final arbiter, but not sole authority or source. Zwingli also, who was a bit more contentious, was not against consulting commentaries, but refused to make it a rule. And to this point, Matthew Barrett further writes of him that Zwingli carefully avoided what we call nuda scriptura, or that idea that everything can only be sourced from Scripture or it needs to be rejected. He answered that it is just fine to read the Fathers and benefit from them. However, should something be discovered that runs contrary to the Scriptures, one must let the Scriptures correct the fathers. And we see the same with Martin Bucer, we see the same with Thomas Cranmer in England, and we see the same with Calvin, who wrote, "Therefore, in reading the profane authors," get this, in reading the profane authors, "the admirable light of truth displayed in them should remind us that the human mind, however much fallen and perverted from its original integrity, is still adorned and invested with admirable gifts from its Creator. If we reflect that the Spirit of God is the only fountain of truth, we will be careful as we would avoid offering insult to Him, not to reject or condemn the truth wherever it appears." In other words, he's saying, there's value in reading even the profane, but we test it by Scripture. In conclusion, then, my paper points out that when understood adequately, both the context of sola scriptura as well as the example of its application in the early reformers shows that sola scriptura is not about rejecting all other sources of authority, but rather interacting with them vigorously, testing all things according to Scripture, rejecting what contradicts, embracing what coincides, and holding all else lightly as opinion. This then has direct impact on how even conservatives can approach badly needed leadership material. And if we can put that aside, then maybe we can begin to understand truly where the resistance comes in and go even deeper. Thank you for listening to my paper. Have a great day.